been looking at ocean biodiversity, thus the diversity of species that live in the world's oceans. About 20 years ago, biologists developed the idea of what they called biodiversity hotspots. These are the areas which have the greatest mixture of species. So one example is Madagascar. These hotspots are significant because they allow us to locate these areas for focusing efforts at conservation. Biologists can identify hotspots on land fairly easily, but until recently, very little was known about species distribution and diversity in the oceans, and no one even knew if hotspots existed there. Then a Canadian biologist called Paul did some research in 2005 on data on ocean species that he got from the fishing industry, whom located 5 hotspots for large ocean predators like sharks, and looked at what they had in common. The main thing he'd expected to find was that they had very high concentrations of food. But to his surprise, that was only true for 4 of the hotspots. The remaining hotspot was quite partly out in that regard. But high temperatures, even when it was cold at greater depths, so this seemed to be a factor in supporting a diverse range of these larger predators. However, this wasn't enough on its own, because he also found that the water needed to have enough oxygen in it. So these 2 factors seemed necessary to support the high metabolic rate of these large fish. A couple of years later, in 2007, a researcher called Lisa Plains, who was working in California, also started looking for ocean hotspots, but not for fish. What she was interested in was marine mammals, things like seals, and she found 3 places in the oceans which were hotspots, and that these had in common was that these hotspots were all located at boundaries between ocean currents, and this seems to be the sort of place that has lots of the plankton that some of these species feed on. So now people who want to protect the species that are endangered need to get as much information as possible. For example, there's an international project called the Census of Marine Life. They've been surveying oceans all over the world, including the Arctic. One thing they found there which stunned other researchers was that there were large numbers of species which live below the ice, sometimes under the layer up to 20 meters thick. Some of these species had never been seen before. They've been even found species of octopus living in these conditions. And other scientists working on the same projects, but researching very different habitats on the ocean floor, have found large number of species congregating around volcanoes, attracted to them by the warmth and nutrients there. However, biologists still don't know how serious the threat to their survival is for each individual species. So a body called the Global Marine Species Assessment is now creating a list of endangered species on land. So they consider things like the size of the population, how many members of one species there are in a particular place, and then they look at their distribution and geographical terms. Although this is quite difficult when you are looking at fish, because they are so mobile. And then thirdly, they calculate the rate at which the decline of the species is happening. So far, only 1,500 species have been assessed, but they want to increase the figure to 20,000 for each one they use the data they collect on that species to produce a map showing its distribution. Ultimately, they will be able to use this to figure out not only where more species are located, but also where they are more threatened. So finally, what can be done to return the diversity of species in the world's oceans? Firstly, we need to set up more reservoirs in our oceans, places where marine species are protected. We have some, but not enough in addition to preserve species such as leatherback turtles, which live out in the high seas but have their nesting site on the American coast. We need to create corridors for migration so they can get from one area to another safely, as well as this action needs to be taken to lower the level of fishing coasters to prevent overfishing of endangered species. And finally, there's the problem of bycatch. This refers to catching of unwanted fish by fishing posts. They are returned to the sea, but they are often dead or dying if their commercial fishing post used equipment which was more selective, so that only the fishing wanted for consumption was caught. This problem could be overcome. Okay, so does anyone have any